Bob is addicted to alcohol. He began drinking in high school despite having two alcoholic parents and knowing the damage that it can cause a person. As he went on to college, he began drinking even more. He liked how it made him feel, taking away anxiety and making him more sociable at parties. However, his grades began to dip and he would often be hungover the next day. Rather than admit that his drinking was impacting his grades, he became defensive and resisted any change to his behavior. He continued making his way through school until things finally caught up to him in his senior year and he failed all of his fall classes. He was in danger of being expelled from his university, and his drinking increased to every evening and even earlier in the day on occasion. He noticed that when he stopped drinking, even for a day, he began to feel very strong, uncontrollable anxiety. Eventually, he decided that he needed to stop drinking if he was going to make it through his senior year. Rather than seek help or gradually taper off, he stopped cold turkey. He thought if he did this over the winter break, he'd be ready to begin the spring semester with a clear mind. However, abstaining from alcohol was harder than he ever anticipated. By the second day, Bob's anxiety was through the roof. He began to feel his whole body tense and shake. He was sweating profusely. At times, he was confused as to his location and even began hearing low murmuring voices that didn't seem to come from any specific location. The pain of this experience was too much, and so one evening, only 5 days after he stopped drinking, he went to the location in his home where the alcohol was and grabbed a bottle of whiskey. In today's video, we'll discuss what's happening to Bob at the neurochemical level, considering the role of brain cells and their chemical messengers. One of the most important cells that makes up the brain is called the neuron. The human brain has about 100 billion of them, and they consist of a cell body containing the nucleus. Connected to the cell body is an axon, which is a long tail-like structure that ends at a set of axon terminals. Those terminals contain vesicles that house chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. Two basic neurotransmitters are GABA and glutamate. GABA has an inhibitory effect on the brain, leading to lowered activity. A set of mild tranquilizers called Benzodiazepines affect GABA, leading to a calming effect. Glutamate has an overall excitatory effect on the brain, and alcohol is thought to inhibit the activity of this neurotransmitter. The overall result is a calming effect on the brain. Since glutamate is also involved in learning and memory, excessive alcohol consumption is thought to possibly interfere with the formation of memories, leading to what is commonly called a blackout. At the other end of the neuron, attached to the cell body, are branch-like extensions called dendrites. Whereas axons are responsible for sending messages to other neurons, dendrites are responsible for receiving messages. For our purposes, the most important area of focus is where the axon terminals of one neuron meet the dendrites of another neuron, what is called the synapse. This area consists of a presynaptic membrane, where we find axon terminals, the postsynaptic membrane, where we find dendrites, and the space between these membranes called the synaptic gap. This intercellular space is where neurotransmitters cross over to communicate with other neurons. Dendrites contain gates that open and close in response to these neurotransmitters. When these gates open, they allow an exchange of ions such as sodium and potassium to pass in and out of the cell. When this happens, the neuron fires, sending an electrical signal down the axon of the neuron, causing that receiving neuron to potentially also fire. This firing of an electrical signal is called an action potential. Neurons either have an action potential or they don't. They don't fire at different intensities. Instead, a response entails a greater rate of firing within a given period, and not because it is firing more or less powerfully. This characteristic of neurons, to either fire or not, is called the all or none law. The inside of the neuron normally has a relatively greater negative charge than the surrounding extracellular fluid. In other words, there are proportionally more negatively than positively charged ions inside. This situation is known as a resting potential. Resting potential is the status of a neuron when it's not firing. In order to have an action potential, the neuron has to receive a sufficient amount of stimulation, generally from neurotransmitters, that leads to the gates located on dendrites to open. Once they open, they allow positive ions in, activating an electrical impulse. So what's happening to Bob's neurons? Psychoactive drugs work by affecting one or more aspects of this process. Many drugs mimic the properties of neurotransmitters, causing a similar response in the brain. Other drugs effectively block the receptors on the dendrites, preventing a particular neurotransmitter from doing its job. Alcohol leads to a complex and still not completely understood set of effects in the brain. It both increases the release of GABA in the presynaptic neuron and enhances GABA receptors in the postsynaptic neuron. Again, GABA has an inhibitory effect, reducing the overall activity of the brain. Alcohol suppresses glutamate signals as well in specific areas of the brain. Since glutamate has an excitatory effect, reducing its activity also reduces the overall activity of the brain. Finally, alcohol promotes the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in areas of the brain responsible for motivation and reward. This leads to its pleasurable effects, but also gives rise to its addictive properties. The brain adjusts to alcohol's effects in a number of ways, such as producing more receptors. This then requires more and more alcohol to be consumed in order to produce similar effects. This is what is called tolerance. It also leads to the brain reducing the natural production of these neurotransmitters. So when Bob stops drinking cold turkey, he has both a sudden drop in neurotransmitters and an increased number of receptors requiring them. This leads to some of the unpleasant withdrawal symptoms that accompany his alcohol abstinence. Withdrawal can be particularly dangerous in some situations as glutamate becomes excessive relative to GABA, leading not only to severe anxiety, but even more severe reactions such as hallucinations and even seizures. It's for this reason that someone with severe alcohol dependence who stops suddenly is at risk of death. So someone who intends to stop drinking after lengthy and heavy consumption, it's important that they receive professional help during the process of withdrawal. Also, because the way the brain is changed from this pattern of behavior, substance counseling and attending support groups such as 12-step programs is often recommended to prevent relapse. While the 12-step programs are not universally accepted by mental health professionals as an effective treatment for addiction, I'd recommend that all considering to enter into a mental health profession at least be familiar with their principles and methods. One such principle found in their first step which is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. The first step is not necessarily about stopping or taking specific actions. Rather, it's about self-acceptance. The difficulty with many addictions is that we convince ourselves that we can control our behavior, that we can stop whenever we want to. And when we can't, we feel tremendous shame about our failures to stop. This shame is perhaps particularly acute in a society that values independence and self-determination. However, thinking that we're in control and the shame that quickly follows when we fail to exert that control spirals into a greater need to turn to our drug of choice in order to escape this painful shame. Admitting powerlessness, or what we can consider to be a radical self-acceptance, is not about foregoing responsibility, nor should it be seen as admitting failure. It's about admitting our humanness. It's about being healthily vulnerable about our faults and indeed our brokenness. Paradoxically, it's by taking this first step that we open a space within ourselves to begin doing the hard work of recovery. And it's the kind of work that Bob will need to do in order to overcome the demands and changes in his brain chemistry that have resulted from not only the genetics that he inherited, but also the extended period of alcohol consumption, which changed the nature in which the way in which his neurotransmitters function in his brain. If you like this video and want to see more, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.